The ancient grain silo that collapsed on Jacob Harmon's drought-stricken Montana farm wouldn't just reveal a hidden tunnel to an astonishing fortune. It would uncover a Prohibition-era secret so significant that it would force historians to rewrite the criminal underworld's role in shaping America's rural economy. What Jacob discovered beneath decades of dust and forgotten grain would connect his struggling family farm to one of the most notorious crime syndicates of the 1920s. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you, revealing how his great-grandfather's seemingly honest agricultural legacy concealed a dangerous double life that had remained buried for nearly a century. The autumn of 2023 had been particularly cruel to the farms of Wheatland County. 3 consecutive years of diminishing rainfall had transformed once fertile fields into cracked, unyielding earth. The massive dust clouds that occasionally rose from the parched landscape seemed to mock the farmers' increasingly desperate efforts to coax life from the soil. Combines harvested meager yields, their metal teeth cutting through sparse wheat stands that barely justified the fuel consumed to gather them. Jacob Harmon's 480-acre legacy, passed down through 4 generations of his family, was among the hardest hit. At 42, his weathered face had accumulated more lines in the past 3 seasons than in all the previous decades combined. His grandfather's stories of the farm's legendary harvests of the 1950s and 60s now seemed like fairy tales, impossible fictions from a different world. The Harmon farm had once been the crown jewel of the county, its 3 towering silos standing as monuments to agricultural prosperity. Now, those same silos stood as hollow reminders of better days. 2 had been emptied and sold for scrap metal. The previous year, a desperate measure to keep the bank at bay for one more growing season. Only the oldest silo, a massive concrete cylinder built by Jacob's great-grandfather Robert in 1922, remained standing, a stubborn patriarch refusing to acknowledge the family's declining fortunes. Local farmers had always remarked on the peculiar construction of the old silo. Unlike others built during that era, Robert Harmon had insisted on an unusual foundation design and curious interior features that seemed excessive for grain storage. The construction had reportedly consumed much of the farm's profits for 2 consecutive years, an expense that had puzzled neighbors who practiced more frugal farm management. Old Robert was either a visionary or a fool, Jacob's father used to say, spending that kind of money on a fancy silo when a simple one would have done the job. But Robert had been insistent, personally overseeing every aspect of the construction, importing specialized materials from as far away as Chicago and New York. The building plans had been jealously guarded, with only Robert and a small crew of workers, none local, involved in certain phases of the construction. Over the decades, the silo had served its ostensible purpose well enough, storing the farm's grain harvests through boom and bust cycles. But maintenance had grown increasingly expensive, and in recent years, structural concerns had limited its use. Hairline cracks had appeared in the concrete, widening with each freeze-thaw cycle. Jacob had been planning to decommission it after this harvest, salvaging what materials he could to shore up the farm's dwindling finances. What made the oldest silo particularly distinctive wasn't just its age or unusual construction, but the persistent local rumors that swirled around it. Some of the county's eldest residents still whispered about the strange nighttime deliveries. During its construction, the unfamiliar vehicles with out-of-state plates that would arrive after midnight and depart before dawn. Others recalled how fiercely protective Robert had been of the structure, refusing to allow anyone, even family, to access certain areas without his supervision. Jacob's father, Thomas, had always dismissed these stories as small-town gossip, the kind that inevitably attached itself to any family successful enough to inspire envy. But he himself had maintained his father's tradition of personally managing the silo's maintenance, hiring only trusted workers and overseeing all repairs himself. The strange metal box Jacob had discovered in his father's study after his death 3 years ago had added another layer to the mystery. Hidden behind a false panel in the antique desk, the locked container had resisted all his attempts to open it. The only marking, a small engraved symbol resembling a wheat stalk crossed with what looked like a key, offered no clear explanation of its contents or purpose. After multiple failed attempts to open it without damaging the box, Jacob had set it aside, another puzzle from his family's past that would have to wait for better days. Those better days seemed increasingly unlikely as Jacob surveyed his withered fields from the farmhouse porch that September morning. His wife, Melissa, a fourth-grade teacher at the county school, had taken on extra tutoring hours to supplement their dwindling farm income. Their teenage children, Emma and Lucas, had grown accustomed to working the farm before and after school, their childhood giving way to premature responsibility. The farm's outdated equipment limped through each season, patched together with ingenuity and desperation. The old combine harvester, which should have been replaced 5 years ago, required daily maintenance just to keep running. The irrigation system, designed for wetter years, struggled to distribute the diminishing water allocations efficiently. Each repair drained their savings further, and the bank's patience was wearing thin. That morning, as Jacob reviewed the latest foreclosure notices spread across the kitchen table, the decision to finally decommission the old silo seemed inevitable. Sentinel Agribusiness, the corporate farming conglomerate that had been systematically acquiring struggling family farms throughout the county, had made another offer the previous week. The figure, while substantially less than the farm's historical value, would at least clear their debts and perhaps leave enough to give Emma and Lucas a decent start in life, away from the increasingly precarious business of family farming. "The Thompsons sold yesterday," Melissa said quietly, placing a cup of coffee beside the scattered papers. "Sentinels moving in their equipment next week." The Thompsons had been farming neighboring land for as long as the Harmons, over a century, of shared fences, equipment loans, and harvest celebrations. Now they were gone, another family farm absorbed into Sentinel's ever-expanding industrial agricultural operations. "I'm not making that call yet," Jacob replied, his jaw tightening. "We've got one more harvest to bring in. After that—" He left the sentence unfinished, the implications hanging in the morning air. What Jacob couldn't know as he stared at the looming silhouette of his great-grandfather's silo was that by sunset his concerns about the farm's financial future would be transformed in ways he couldn't imagine. The mystery of Robert Harmon's peculiar construction choices was about to reveal itself in dramatic fashion, connecting past to present and changing the family's fortunes literally and figuratively. As dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the first substantial rainfall in months, forces both natural and historical were converging to uncover secrets nearly a century in the making. The Harmon farm had always stood apart from the surrounding agricultural landscape of Wheatland County. Located at the confluence of 2 seasonal creeks, the property's natural water advantages had made it particularly valuable since the first homesteaders arrived in the 1880s. The farm's position at the base of Settlers Ridge provided it with both natural windbreaks and rich soil deposits that had accumulated over centuries. Robert Harmon, Jacob's great-grandfather, had acquired the land in 1918 after returning from the Great War. While many speculated that he had purchased the farm with military pay, county records showed he had arrived with substantial capital that exceeded what an army sergeant could have saved. This unexplained wealth had been the first of many mysteries surrounding the taciturn founder of the Harmon agricultural legacy. The farm's early development had coincided with several significant historical currents: the post-war agricultural boom, the early days of Prohibition, and the expansion of transportation networks throughout the American heartland. The main county road, which ran along the farm's eastern boundary, had once been a significant transport route connecting the northern states to distribution centers in the south. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, a fact that seemed unremarkable until viewed through the lens of Prohibition-era smuggling routes. The three silos that dominated the farm skyline had been built in succession, the first and most elaborate in 1922, followed by more conventional structures in 1945 and 1968. The oldest silo's unusual construction had been a subject of speculation for decades. Its concrete foundation extended far deeper than typical agricultural structures, and its walls were notably thicker. Local contractors who had performed minor repairs over the years often commented on the surprising complexity of its interior design, with features that seemed unnecessary for simple grain storage. That old silo's built more like a bank vault than a grain bin, Hank Peterson, the county's oldest living builder, had once remarked to Jacob. "Your great-granddaddy built it to last through Armageddon." The 1920s had been a time of significant tension in Montana's agricultural communities, while the state's vast spaces and sparse population made it ideal territory for bootleggers moving product between Canada and the thirsty speakeasies of Chicago. And points east, its farming communities maintained a complex relationship with prohibition. Publicly, most farm families supported temperance. Privately, many supplemented their agricultural income by cooperating with the elaborate distribution networks that kept alcohol flowing across America despite federal law. Wheatland County's official history celebrated its agricultural pioneers and their struggles against drought, economic hardship, and changing markets. What went unrecorded were the midnight transactions, the hidden storage spaces, and the quiet cooperation that allowed contraband whiskey to move through these same communities. The County Historical Society's carefully maintained archives contained no mention of the area's role in Prohibition-era smuggling, though older residents occasionally shared stories that contradicted this sanitized history. Robert Harmon's position in the community had been one of respected prosperity. County records showed his farm flourishing when many others struggled, particularly during the early years of Prohibition when agricultural prices were unstable. His frequent trips to Chicago and Minneapolis were explained as necessary business connections for selling his grain at premium prices. The construction of his elaborate silo in 1922 at considerable expense had been attributed to forward-thinking agricultural planning. What stood out in retrospect was the timing. The silo's construction had coincided with the height of Chicago, mobster Frank Novak's control of the Midwest distribution network. Novak, a ruthless but business-minded crime boss, had revolutionized bootlegging logistics by establishing a series of weigh stations and storage facilities across the rural Midwest, creating a pipeline that moved Canadian whiskey to Chicago with remarkable efficiency. His operation was notable for recruiting seemingly upstanding citizens in rural communities, particularly farmers with strategic landholdings along transportation routes. While Novak's name appeared nowhere in Wheatland County's official records, his shadow organization had left traces throughout the region. Traces that historians and crime researchers had documented in academic works that rarely circulated among the general public. The peculiar symbol Jacob had found on his great-grandfather's metal box, a wheat stalk crossed with a key, bore striking resemblance to markings found on Prohibition-era artifacts connected to Novak's operation. Though Jacob had no way of knowing this connection, the old silo's position on the Harmon property was itself notable. Situated at the furthest point from the main house, but with direct access to the county road, it occupied a location that would have allowed vehicles to approach and depart with minimal visibility from neighboring farms. A small, seasonal creek ran beneath the ground just east of the structure, creating a natural depression that would later prove significant. Throughout the decades following Prohibition's end, the Harmon farm had transitioned to legitimate prosperity. Robert's son William had expanded the operation through the agricultural boom of the post-war years, and Jacob's father Thomas had modernized their practices during the technological revolutions of the 1970s and 80s. With each generation, the unusual aspects of the original silo faded further into family lore, its secrets, if any existed, seemingly buried with Robert Harmon when he passed in 1967. Climate change had transformed Wheatland County over the past decade. Weather patterns that had remained relatively stable for generations had given way to extreme fluctuations, extended droughts punctuated by intense, often destructive rainfall. The aquifer that had sustained the region's agriculture for a century was depleting faster than it could recharge. Family farms, with their limited capital reserves, struggled to adapt, while corporate agricultural operations like Sentinel Agribusiness had the resources to implement expensive technological solutions. The changing landscape had revealed other secrets as well. As water tables dropped, previously buried features of the land emerged. Old creek beds that had been covered for decades became visible again. Foundations of long-forgotten structures appeared in fields where plows suddenly struck stone. The earth itself seemed to be revealing its history as the climate shifted. The Harmon farm, like others in the region, had become a palimpsest, each generation writing its story over the previous one, but with older narratives occasionally showing through. Jacob, focused on immediate survival, had little time to consider these deeper historical currents. The practical concerns of keeping the bank at bay, maintaining aging equipment, and producing enough yield to justify another growing season consumed his attention. Yet the past was about to assert itself in ways that would force a reckoning with history. The old silo, which had stood as a silent sentinel for over a century, contained more than just the remnants of long-ago harvests. Its secrets, preserved in darkness and silence, were about to emerge into the harsh light of the present day, connecting Jacob Harmon to a legacy he had never suspected and resources he had never imagined. As the drought-stricken land awaited the approaching rainstorm, the first significant precipitation in months, natural forces were conspiring to reveal what human efforts had carefully concealed. The parched earth around the old silo's foundation had contracted, creating subtle shifts in the structure's stability. Hairline cracks had widened into concerning fissures. The coming deluge would be the final factor in an equation that had been calculating itself for nearly a century. The stage was set for revelation, with Jacob Harmon unwittingly positioned at the center of a historical drama that would transform his understanding of his family, his land, and the complex legacy he had inherited. Jacob Harmon's day began like countless others before it, early, with aching joints and the weight of mounting worries. At 42, his body already carried the accumulated strain of decades of physical labor. His hands, calloused and cracked, wrapped around a chipped coffee mug as he stared out the kitchen window at the first hint of dawn, illuminating his struggling fields. The harvest would begin today, though harvest seemed an overly optimistic term for the meager yield awaiting collection. "Equipment's ready," he said, as Melissa entered the kitchen, her teacher's tote bag already packed for the day. "Lucas, and I should be able to start cutting the north section by 7, Melissa nodded, her expression a carefully maintained mask of optimism that had grown thinner with each passing season. Her salary as a teacher had gradually shifted from supplemental income to essential lifeline, as the farm's profitability declined. The extra tutoring hours she'd taken on meant longer days and fewer family dinners. But necessity had long since overruled preference. "Emma has that college visit tomorrow," she reminded him, pouring her coffee into a travel mug. "She'll need the truck." Their daughter's academic promise had been a source of both pride and anxiety. Her aptitude for agricultural science might save the farm if they could somehow afford to send her to the state university. The partial scholarship she'd earned would cover tuition, but not room and board, and the timing coincided with their largest loan payment of the year. "We'll make it work," Jacob said, though the logistics of sparing a vehicle during harvest presented yet another complication. "Lucas can drop her off on his way to pick up those parts in Glendale." Lucas, 17, and already as skilled with machinery as many men twice his age, had inherited his father's taciturn nature and stubborn resilience. His decision to delay his own college applications to help with the farm had been presented as a choice, but felt more like an inevitability. Jacob had watched his son's high school friends make plans for futures away from Wheatland County, while Lucas silently assumed the mantle of family responsibility. The kitchen table, an heirloom piece handcrafted by Jacob's grandfather, was currently obscured by paperwork, bank notices, equipment repair estimates, property tax assessments, and Sentinel Agribusiness's latest acquisition offer. The corporate farming operation had been systematically purchasing struggling family farms throughout the county, consolidating them into industrial-scale operations run by a handful of managers and seasonal workers. Their offer for the Harmon farm had increased by 5% since their last approach 3 months ago, a calculated move that acknowledged both the family's increasing desperation and the property's strategic value to Sentinel's expansion. The figure remained well below what the land would have been worth a decade ago, but represented enough to clear their debts and perhaps provide a modest new beginning elsewhere. Jacob had returned the previous offers unopened. This latest one remained sealed as well, though its mere presence on the table suggested he was at least considering the possibility. Fourth-generation farmers didn't simply walk away from their legacy, except that increasingly they did. 6 family operations within 20 miles had sold to Sentinel in the past 18 months alone. "Dad." Emma appeared in the doorway, already dressed for fieldwork in worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt. At 18, she carried herself with the dual identity of a young woman looking toward the wider world and a farmer's daughter bound to the land. The Weather Service updated their forecast. Storms moving in faster than they thought. "We might only have until mid-afternoon," Jacob nodded, mentally recalculating the day's work. The rain would be welcome, essential even, but its timing complicated the harvest. Cutting wet grain created storage problems, particularly in the aging silos, with their imperfect moisture seals. "We'll focus on the north field," he decided. "It's got the best drainage if the rain comes early. Tell Lucas we're leaving in 15. As Emma disappeared to relay the message, Jacob turned back to the financial paperwork. The farm's operating. Loan was coming due in 6 weeks, and the projected harvest wouldn't generate nearly enough revenue to cover it. The equipment loan for the irrigation system they'd installed 2 years ago, a desperate measure against the worsening drought, had 3 years remaining but contained a clause allowing the bank to demand full payment if they defaulted on any other loans. Melissa rested her hand briefly on his shoulder as she passed, a simple gesture that conveyed both support and shared concern. They'd stopped discussing financial specifics months ago, both tacitly recognizing that enumeration of their challenges only deepened their sense of helplessness. "I'll be home by 6, unless the study group runs long," she said, gathering her things. "There's stew in the slow cooker." After she left, Jacob allowed himself 5 more minutes with the paperwork, though the numbers remained stubbornly unchanged, regardless of how many times he reviewed them. Without a miracle, a sudden spike in grain prices, an unexpected inheritance, or a lottery win, the Harmon farm would likely face foreclosure before spring planting. The old silo loomed in his thoughts as he finally gathered his work gloves and headed out to the equipment barn. Its decommissioning after this harvest would provide a temporary financial reprieve, scrap value, and reduced insurance costs. But the emotional weight of dismantling a structure his great-grandfather had built felt like yet another failure. Outside, the morning air carried an unusual heaviness. The approaching storm system had pushed humidity ahead of it, creating a thickness that felt foreign after months of dry conditions. Dark clouds massed on the western horizon, their undersides tinged with the ominous purple-grey that presaged significant rainfall. Lucas had already started the combine harvester, its aging engine protesting with a diesel rattle that suggested yet another mechanical issue developing. He performed the pre-operation checks with practiced efficiency, his expression revealing nothing of the disappointment he must feel at harvesting such poor yields. "Southfield's bone dry," he reported, as Jacob approached, "ground's cracking worse than last week. If this rain doesn't soak deep, we'll lose the winter wheat we just planted." Jacob nodded, having already calculated this risk. The winter wheat represented their hope for early spring income, slender as that hope might be. "We'll check the seed beds tomorrow after the rain. Might need to reseed the lowest sections." Emma joined them, bringing the additional diesel cans needed for the day's operation. The three Harmons worked with the coordinated efficiency of a family long accustomed to functioning as a unit, each anticipating the other's needs without unnecessary conversation. As they prepared to begin the day's harvest, Jacob found his gaze repeatedly drawn to the old silo standing sentinel at the property's edge. The morning light illuminated hairline cracks in its concrete exterior that seemed more pronounced than he remembered. Years of deferred maintenance had taken their toll, with each freeze-thaw cycle expanding existing weaknesses. Something about the structure's silhouette against the darkening sky triggered an unexpected memory. His grandfather William, normally reticent about family history, had once mentioned that Robert had built the silo to secure the future against lean times. Jacob had assumed this referred simply to grain storage as protection against poor harvests, but in the context of their current financial crisis, the phrasing suddenly seemed to carry additional weight. The distant rumble of thunder pulled him back to immediate concerns. With the storm approaching faster than anticipated, they needed to harvest as much as possible before the rain arrived. He pushed thoughts of the silo aside and climbed into the combine's cab, focusing on the day's work rather than century-old family mysteries or the farm's uncertain future. What Jacob couldn't know, as the massive harvester lurched into motion, was that the approaching storm would trigger a chain of events connecting past and present in ways he couldn't imagine. The old silo, with its peculiar construction and hidden purposes, was about to yield secrets that would transform his understanding of his family's legacy and potentially alter the Harmon farm's fate entirely. The Harmon family's connection to their land transcended simple ownership. 4 generations had worked the same soil, weathered the same seasonal challenges, and passed down not just property, but an intricate knowledge of the farm's particular characteristics, which sections drained poorly after heavy rains, where the soil retained moisture longest during drought, which fields were most vulnerable to early frosts. As Jacob guided the combine through the sparse wheat, his movements followed patterns established decades before he was born. His grandfather, William, had formalized the farm's harvesting approach in the 1950s, determining the optimal sequence of fields based on careful observation of drainage patterns and sun exposure. Jacob's father, Thomas, had maintained these practices, adapting them only slightly to accommodate newer equipment. Now Jacob continued the tradition, muscle memory and generational wisdom guiding his hands on the controls. The Harmon farm's history was embedded in every structure and fence line. The main barn, built in 1935 to replace the original that had burned during a lightning storm, featured hand-hewn support beams that Thomas and William had salvaged from an abandoned homestead 10 miles north. The eastern property line followed a stone wall constructed during the Depression, when Robert hired unemployed local men to clear rocks from the fields, providing crucial income to desperate families while improving his own land. Even the equipment, she'd contained layers of history. Its concrete floor, poured in 1962, had the handprints of 9-year-old Thomas preserved in one corner, alongside similar impressions from each generation that followed. Jacob remembered the day his own children had added their marks during a renovation, when Emma was 7 and Lucas 5, a conscious continuation of family tradition. Despite these connections, significant gaps existed in Jacob's understanding of his family's past. Robert Harmon remained particularly enigmatic, unlike William and Thomas, who featured prominently in family stories and local historical accounts. The farm's founder had left a curiously limited record of his personal history. The few photographs of Robert showed a tall, austere man with hooded eyes and a formal bearing unusual for a farmer of his era. He appeared in county records as a founding member of the agricultural cooperative and a generous contributor to the local school, but personal details remained sparse. Even his marriage to Jacob's great-grandmother Catherine was documented primarily through practical matters, property transfers and business arrangements, rather than social announcements. This historical vacuum had never particularly troubled Jacob until recently. The discovery of the metal box with its strange insignia had sparked questions about Robert that now seemed increasingly relevant as the farm's future hung in balance. What resources had allowed a returning soldier to purchase prime agricultural land when many veterans struggled to find any employment? How had the farm prospered during the agricultural depression of the 1920s when neighboring operations failed? Why build such an elaborate silo at tremendous expense during economically precarious times? As the combine completed its first pass through the north field, Jacob spotted a pickup truck approaching along the access road. Howard Phillips, their nearest neighbor and one of the few remaining independent farmers in the area. Howard, in his 70s and stubbornly resisting retirement, had been a fixture in Jacob's life since childhood. He had worked alongside Thomas during particularly busy harvests and had taught Jacob to drive a tractor when he was barely tall. Enough to reach the pedals, Jacob brought the combine to a halt and climbed down as Howard parked nearby. The older man moved stiffly as he emerged from his truck, his weathered face creased with concern. "Storm's moving faster than they're saying on the radio," Howard called over the idling combine engine. "Got my weather station showing heavy cells. Developing west of Miller's Ridge. You've got 3 hours at most before it hits." Jacob nodded his thanks. Howard's weather predictions, based on decades of observation and an expensive monitoring system purchased during more prosperous years, were typically more accurate than official forecasts for their specific location. "Trying to get the north section done before it hits," Jacob replied. "Everything else can wait until after the rain passes." Howard's gaze drifted to the old silo, its concrete exterior now clearly showing stress fractures that had expanded since the last growing season. "You still planning to take down Robert's Folly after harvest?" The local nickname for the oldest silo had emerged during its construction, when neighbors questioned its elaborate design and excessive cost. The term had persisted through decades, though usually not used within earshot of the Harmon family, out of respect. "Don't have much choice," Jacob answered. "Insurance won't cover it another year without repairs we can't afford." Howard was silent for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "My daddy worked on that silo, you know. Not the main construction, Robert. Brought in outside contractors for that, but Daddy helped with some of the finishing work." This was news to Jacob. "I didn't know that." Howard nodded slowly. "Daddy didn't talk about it much. Said Robert had him and the other local boys sign some kind of confidentiality agreement. Unusual for farm work back then." Jacob's interest sharpened. Did he ever say why? Not directly. Howard squinted at the structure, but he did mention that the foundation went down a lot deeper than made sense for a grain silo, and there were sections the local workers weren't allowed to access during construction. He shrugged. Course, rumors were plenty back in those days. Prohibition made people suspicious. Before Jacob could press for more details, Lucas signaled from the edge of the field, pointing urgently toward the western sky where the cloud bank had noticeably darkened. Better get back to it, Howard said. Just wanted to give you the weather heads up, and Jacob... He hesitated. If you do start dismantling that old silo, might be worth taking a careful look at what's inside before you bring it down. Family. History has a way of turning valuable when you least expect it. As Howard drove away, Jacob returned to the combine, his mind now divided between the immediate pressure of the approaching storm and fresh questions about his great-grandfather's mysterious construction project. The harvest continued with increased urgency as the clouds advanced. Emma and Lucas worked in synchronized efficiency, operating the grain cart and transport truck to keep the combine moving without interruption. Despite their efforts, it became clear they wouldn't complete the North Field before the storm arrived. The darkening sky and rising wind forced Jacob to make the difficult decision to secure the equipment earlier than planned. As they hurriedly prepared the machinery for heavy rain, the first substantial drops began to fall, fat, widely spaced, harbingers of the deluge to come. The parched earth seemed to sigh as moisture struck its surface, releasing the distinctive scent of rain on long, dry soil. "That's it for today," Jacob called over the strengthening wind. "Let's get everything under cover." They worked quickly to position equipment in the protection of the main barn and equipment shed. The rainfall intensified rapidly, transitioning from scattered drops to sheets of water within minutes. Lightning flashed across the western sky, followed by the deep rumble of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. As they made a final check of the secured equipment, Jacob noticed water already pooling around the base of the old silo. The eroded soil surrounding its foundation, cracked from months of drought, was channeling rather than absorbing the sudden rainfall. A thin stream had begun flowing along the silo's northern edge, disappearing into one of the larger foundation. "Cracks! That doesn't look good," Lucas observed, following his father's gaze. Jacob frowned. "Soil's too dry to take this much water this quickly. It's all running off instead of soaking in." A particularly violent lightning strike illuminated the scene, momentarily transforming the rain into silver streaks against the darkened landscape. The thunder that followed was immediate and deafening, suggesting the lightning had struck somewhere on the property. "Inside, now," Jacob ordered, ushering Emma and Lucas toward the house as the storm's full fury descended upon them. From the shelter of the farmhouse porch, they watched as the rain transformed into a torrential downpour. Water cascaded from the roof in unbroken sheets, overwhelming gutters and downspouts. The farm lanes became instant streams, carrying topsoil in muddy rivulets across ground too hard-packed to absorb the sudden moisture. Through the grey curtain of rain, Jacob kept his eyes on the old silo. The water flow around its base had visibly increased, and something about the structure's silhouette seemed slightly off, though the poor visibility made it difficult to be certain. A sense of unease settled over him as lightning continued to flash across the sky, illuminating the farm in strobing bursts of harsh white light. What Howard Phillips had said about the silo's unusual construction features echoed in Jacob's mind. For generations, the Harmon family had accepted the structure as simply an agricultural oddity, an overly elaborate grain storage facility built by a perhaps overly cautious founder. Now, with the building visibly showing the strain of age and weather, Jacob wondered what other secrets might be literally crumbling before their eyes. The storm's intensity peaked as evening approached, transforming the drought-stricken landscape into a chaotic waterscape. Rain hammered against the farmhouse windows with percussive force, while wind-driven torrents bent the few trees on the property into strained, unnatural shapes. The Harmon family gathered in the kitchen, their harvest abruptly halted, listening to the weather radio's steady stream of flash flood warnings for Wheatland County and surrounding areas. 6 inches in 3 hours, Melissa remarked, looking up from her phone, where she'd been monitoring the local weather station's updates. They're saying it's the heaviest rainfall recorded in the county since 1978. Jacob nodded grimly. The sudden transition from extreme drought to deluge represented the worst possible scenario for their parched fields. Instead of soaking into the soil, the water was primarily running off, carrying precious topsoil with it and creating erosion channels that would require repair before spring planting. Porter Creek Bridge is flooded, Lucas reported, scrolling through messages from friends. Sheriffs closed County Road 22. Thompson's place has water in their first floor. The Thompson farm lay in lower ground 3 miles east. If their buildings were flooding, significant water was moving through the region's watershed. Water that would eventually pass through the seasonal creek beds that traversed the Harmon property. A particularly violent thunder crash rattled the windows, causing all 4 of them to instinctively duck. The subsequent flash illuminated the kitchen in harsh white light before plunging them into darkness as the power failed. "Right on schedule," Jacob muttered, reaching for the flashlight he'd already positioned on the counter in anticipation of this inevitable development. Rural power outages were a standard feature of serious storms in Wheatland County, where aging infrastructure and limited maintenance budgets meant electrical service was often the first casualty of severe weather. Emma had already collected the emergency lantern from its storage place, its warm glow creating a small island of light in the darkened kitchen. The family moved with practiced efficiency, implementing their well-established power outage routine, checking water supplies, securing perishable foods, and confirming the generator was ready if needed for essential systems. "I need to check the equipment barn," Jacob said, pulling on his rain gear. "Make sure nothing's leaking onto the electrical systems." "I'll come with you," Lucas offered. "Take 2 of us to secure the door properly in this wind." Jacob nodded, grateful for his son's practical thinking. "Emma, stay with your mother. Keep an eye on the basement. If you see any water coming in, use the sump pump." Melissa handed them the more powerful flashlight. "Be careful. That lightning's hitting awfully close." Stepping outside felt like entering another world. The rain struck with physical force, while wind-driven water created a disorienting visual curtain that limited visibility to mere yards. Jacob and Lucas leaned into the gale, heads down, as they made their determined way toward the equipment barn. The beam of their flashlight caught something unexpected as they passed the old pickup truck, a substantial flow of water streaming from the direction of the ancient silo. This wasn't merely rain runoff, it was a concentrated channel, suggesting significant volume and force. "That's not right," Jacob shouted over the storm's roar, changing direction toward the silo. Lucas followed without question, understanding his father's concern. The silo's structural integrity had been questionable even before this unprecedented deluge. If it was channeling water in unusual ways, the situation warranted immediate investigation. As they approached the massive concrete cylinder, their flashlight beam revealed an alarming sight. The previously narrow crack in the foundation had expanded significantly, with water now pouring into it rather than merely seeping. More concerning, the ground around the silo's northern side appeared to be subsiding, creating a depression that was rapidly filling with swirling muddy water. "The foundation's undermining," Lucas called, immediately grasping the implications. "That water's washing out whatever's underneath." Jacob's stomach tightened. A silo collapse wouldn't just mean the loss of a historical structure. It could potentially damage other nearby farm buildings or equipment if it fell in the wrong direction. The immediate safety concern overrode any sentimental attachment to his great-grandfather's construction. "We need to check how bad it is," he shouted, circling toward the silo's access door. "Then we'll get back to the house and call emergency services if necessary." The silo's main entrance, a heavy metal door installed during renovations in the 1960s, was located on the structure's southern side. As they rounded the massive cylinder, fighting against wind and rain, an ominous groaning sound rose above the storm's cacophony, the distinctive stress noise of concrete under extreme pressure. "Dad, wait!" Lucas grabbed Jacob's arm, pointing upward with his flashlight. The beam caught the silo's upper edge, where a new, jagged crack had appeared, extending at least 15 feet down from the top. As they watched, small fragments of concrete broke free, plummeting to the ground nearby. "Back to the house now," Jacob ordered, all thoughts of investigation abandoned in the face of imminent structural failure. "Go!" They had taken only a few steps when a deafening crack split the air, rising even above the storm's fury. Jacob instinctively threw his arm across Lucas's chest, pushing both of them backward as a massive section of the silo's upper wall broke free. The enormous concrete chunk crashed to the ground less than 20 yards from where they stood, the impact sending shudders through the earth beneath their feet. The partial collapse seemed to accelerate a chain reaction. The groaning intensified, now mixed with the sharp reports of internal structural elements giving way. More pieces began to fall, some small, others frighteningly large, as the century-old structure began to surrender to gravity and water damage. "Run!" Jacob pushed Lucas ahead of him, both of them sprinting toward the relative safety of the equipment barn, the closest substantial shelter. They had nearly reached it when the most catastrophic sound yet erupted behind them. A deep, resonant boom, followed by the unmistakable roar of tons of concrete and metal succumbing to total structural failure. The ground beneath them trembled with the impact as they finally reached the barn door, wrenching it open and diving inside. The noise continued for what seemed an impossibly long time, a symphony of destruction as a century of farming history collapsed into rubble. When comparative quiet finally returned, broken only by the continuing storm, Jacob and Lucas cautiously approached the wide door, shining their flashlight out into the rain. Where the silo had stood for nearly 100 years, there was now only a partial foundation ring surrounding a dark, gaping hole. Fragments of concrete were scattered in a radius of at least 50 yards, some chunks larger than the farm's pickup truck. But it was the hole itself that commanded their attention. Far from being the shallow foundation typical of agricultural silos, this excavation extended deep into the earth, its full depth obscured by shadow and swirling rainwater that now poured into the opening from all sides. "What the hell?" Lucas whispered, his expression reflecting the same shock Jacob felt. The flashlight's beam, inadequate for illuminating the full extent of the revealed cavity, caught what appeared to be a constructed tunnel entrance at the hole's base. Not a natural formation or simple foundation, but a deliberately engineered access point with what looked like reinforced walls. "That's not part of any silo I've ever seen," Jacob said, his mind struggling to process the implications. The storm momentarily forgotten, he moved closer to the edge of the barn doorway, trying to direct the flashlight beam more effectively into the mysterious opening. A sudden intensity in the rainfall drove them back inside, but not before Jacob spotted something metallic reflecting their light from within the exposed tunnel entrance, something that appeared to be a door or hatch, partially obscured by debris from the collapse. "We need better lights," he decided, turning to the storage cabinet where they kept emergency equipment. "And we need to secure that area before the hole gets any bigger." As Lucas helped him gather more powerful flashlights and rain gear, Jacob's mind raced with questions. The existence of an underground structure beneath the silo conflicted with everything he thought he knew about his family's farm. Why would his great-grandfather Robert have built such a thing? What purpose could a hidden subterranean chamber possibly have served for a grain farmer in 1920s Montana? The strange metal box found in his father's study suddenly seemed less like an isolated curiosity and more like a piece of a larger puzzle. A puzzle whose outlines were only now becoming visible as the storm literally unearthed secrets buried. For generations, Dad, Lucas's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Should we tell Mom and Emma what we found? Jacob hesitated. The storm was still raging, and whatever lay beneath the collapsed silo had remained hidden for nearly a century. It could wait a few more hours until safer conditions prevailed. Let's secure the area first, he decided. Make sure nothing else is going to collapse. Once the storm passes, we'll figure out what we're dealing with. But even as he spoke, Jacob knew that the discovery of this hidden structure had already irrevocably changed something fundamental. Whatever revelations awaited in that underground chamber, the Harmon family's understanding of their heritage and perhaps their future was about to be transformed in ways he could not yet imagine. By dawn, the storm had reduced to a steady drizzle, having deposited nearly 8 inches of rain across Wheatland County. The sunrise revealed a transformed landscape, fields turned to shallow lakes, farm lanes converted to muddy streams, and debris scattered by wind and water across the property. But nothing had changed more dramatically than the site where the old silo had stood for nearly a century. In the grey morning light, Jacob, Melissa, Emma, and Lucas stood at a safe distance from the massive crater, staring in collective disbelief at what the collapse had revealed. With the storm's fury abated and visibility restored, the full extent of the hidden structure beneath the silo was now apparent, and it defied all logical explanation. "That's not a foundation," Emma stated what they all were thinking. "That's an entire underground complex." The flashlights had proven inadequate the previous night, revealing only hints of what lay beneath. Now, with daylight filtering into the exposed chamber, they could see that the silo had been built atop a carefully engineered underground structure. Concrete walls reinforced with steel extended at least 20 feet below ground level, creating a circular chamber approximately 40 feet in diameter, considerably larger than the silo's footprint suggested. Most striking was the tunnel entrance visible at the chamber's base. Unlike the rough construction one might expect in a farm structure, this featured precisely cut stone blocks, forming an arched doorway that would have looked more appropriate in a bank or government building than on agricultural property. "We need to get down there," Jacob said, his voice tight with controlled excitement and apprehension. "Lucas, get the extension ladder from the equipment barn. Emma, bring the emergency work lights and that coil of rope from the storage shed." Melissa gripped his arm. "Jacob, is that safe? The structure could still be unstable after the collapse." "We'll be careful," he assured her, though his eyes never left the exposed chamber. "I'll go down first. Make sure it's secure before anyone else follows." The preparations took nearly an hour. They positioned the farm truck near the edge of the collapse, securing one end of the rope to its tow hitch. Jacob donned a construction helmet with attached headlamp, work gloves, and sturdy boots. Lucas insisted on similar equipment for himself, clearly planning to accompany his father despite not having been explicitly invited. "I should come too," Emma argued, as Jacob checked the ladder's stability where they'd positioned it against the chamber's concrete wall. "I'm taking structural engineering next year. I can help assess if it's safe." "Next time," Jacob promised, recognizing the determination in his daughter's eyes, the same expression she'd worn when insisting on learning to operate the combine at 14. "If Lucas and I confirm it's stable, you'll be the first one down after us." The descent into the chamber was more straightforward than expected. Despite the silo's catastrophic collapse, the underground structure appeared remarkably intact. The Concrete walls showed little damage beyond some surface cracking, suggesting construction far more substantial than typical agricultural buildings of the 1920s, or even modern ones. At the bottom of the ladder, Jacob stood on a solid concrete floor, littered with debris from the collapsed ceiling. Water had pooled in the lowest sections, but appeared to be draining through designed channels in the floor. Lucas joined him moments later, his expression transforming from caution to amazement as he surveyed the chamber. "This wasn't built by farmers," he whispered, running his hand along the nearest wall where embedded iron brackets suggested mounted equipment had once been attached. "This is professional engineering." Jacob nodded, directing his headlamp toward the arched tunnel entrance that had caught their attention the previous night. Now they could see it was actually a doorway, with a massive steel door hanging partially, open from damaged hinges. Its surface, though corroded after decades underground, still displayed an elaborate locking mechanism and what appeared to be the same symbol Jacob had found on the mysterious metal box, a wheat stalk crossed with a key. "Cover my back," Jacob instructed, moving carefully toward the doorway. "If you hear anything shifting or cracking, you call out immediately." The steel door resisted initially, its aged hinges protesting as Jacob pushed against it. With Lucas's help, they managed to create an opening wide enough to slip through. Jacob went first, his headlamp cutting through decades of undisturbed darkness to reveal a sight that stopped him cold. The tunnel beyond stretched approximately 30 feet, before opening into another chamber. But it was the tunnel's contents that defied explanation. Along both walls stood wooden racks holding dozens of glass bottles, their contents dark with age, but their shapes unmistakable. Liquor bottles, hundreds of them, still arranged in neat rows as if awaiting distribution. "Holy shit," Lucas breathed, moving up beside his father. "Is that whiskey?" Jacob confirmed, carefully lifting one dust-covered bottle from its rack. The faded label was still partly legible. "Canadian Club, 1918. He set it back carefully, moving deeper into the tunnel. The preserved bottles gave way to other artifacts, wooden crates stacked against the walls, mechanical parts whose purpose wasn't immediately apparent, and most surprisingly, a narrow-gauge rail system embedded in the floor running the tunnel's length. At the tunnels, and they encountered another steel door, this one closed but not locked. It swung open with surprising ease to reveal the chamber beyond, and with it, the full extent of what had been hidden beneath the Harmon farm for nearly a century. The second chamber was larger than the first, roughly 60 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that had somehow remained intact despite the silo's collapse above. Unlike the entry chamber, this space was filled with organized contents that appeared to have been deliberately preserved. Along one curved wall stood a row of massive oak barrels, their metal hoops rusted but their structures intact. Opposite them, a series of copper and brass machinery components gleamed dully in the headlamp's beam. Distilling equipment, Jacob realized, though far more sophisticated than typical Prohibition-era stills. The chamber's center was dominated by a large wooden desk and filing cabinet, both locked but in remarkable condition considering their age. Above the desk hung a framed photograph that drew Jacob forward as if pulled by an invisible force. A group of men standing before the newly constructed silo, his great-grandfather Robert Harmon at the center. But unlike the formal, distant figure from family photographs, here Robert appeared different, confident, almost cocky, with his arm around a well-dressed man whose face Jacob didn't recognize. "Dad, look at this!" Lucas called from near the barrels. He'd discovered a small door set into the chamber's far wall, another tunnel entrance, this one leading deeper into the earth. Before they could investigate further, a metallic glint caught Jacob's eye from atop the desk. Partially buried under decades of dust lay a key, Not a standard door key, but an ornate brass instrument with an unusual configuration. Jacob's heart raced as he realized it matched the keyhole on the mysterious metal box he'd found in his father's study. "Lucas," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, "go back to the house. Bring that metal box from my bedroom dresser, and tell your mother and sister to come down. They need to see this." As Lucas departed, Jacob carefully examined the key, wiping away accumulated dust with his glove. The symbol embedded in its handle matched the one on the box and the steel door, the wheat stalk intersecting with a key. Not a random design, he now realized, but a deliberate marking, a signature of sorts. The implications were staggering. The old silo hadn't been merely an eccentric agricultural structure, but a deliberate disguise for an elaborate underground operation. Clearly, a Prohibition-era bootlegging facility of substantial scale and sophistication. His great-grandfather Robert Harmon, the foundation of their family's farming legacy, appeared to have been deeply involved in illegal liquor production and distribution during the 1920s. Jacob sank into the desk chair, dust rising around him in a small cloud. Family stories had always portrayed Robert as a hard-working farmer who had built their agricultural operation through determination and sacrifice. Nothing had hinted at this secret enterprise beneath the very fields they'd tended for generations. The sound of voices echoed from the entry tunnel, Melissa and Emma arriving with Lucas, who carried the mysterious metal box. Their exclamations of amazement as they encountered the whiskey storage tunnel brought a smile to Jacob's face, despite his shock. Some discoveries were too extraordinary not to appreciate in the moment, regardless of how they might complicate one's understanding of family history. As his family entered the main chamber, Jacob held up the ornate key, its brass surface catching the light from their headlamps. "I think," he said, "we're about to learn who Robert Harmon really was." The metal box sat on the ancient desk, the focal point of attention for all four Harmons gathered in the underground chamber. Dust motes danced in the beams of their headlamps, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as Jacob carefully inserted the ornate key into the lock. The mechanism resisted at first, decades of inactivity having seized its components, but then yielded with a distinct click that seemed to echo in the cavernous space. "Here goes," Jacob murmured, lifting the lid with deliberate slowness. Inside lay a collection of documents, remarkably well preserved in the dry, cool environment of the sealed container. On top rested a leather-bound ledger, its cover embossed with the now familiar wheat and key symbol. Beneath it were stacks of letters, photographs, and what appeared to be legal documents, all organized with meticulous care. Jacob lifted out the ledger first, placing it gently on the desk surface and opening it to the first page. The handwriting was precise and elegant, not the utilitarian script he would have expected from a farmer, but the practiced penmanship of someone accustomed to formal documentation. "Accounting records, Montana Distribution Network 1919-1927, he read aloud. "Signed, Robert Harmon, Regional Manager." Emma leaned closer, her phone's flashlight adding illumination to the yellowed pages. "Regional Manager? Not owner or operator?" Jacob turned the page to reveal columns of numbers, dates, and cryptic notations that filled dozens of subsequent sheets. The entries documented substantial sums, far more money than grain farming could have generated during that era, especially given the agricultural depression that had gripped the region in the early 1920s. "This is a business ledger," Melissa observed, her teacher's eye quickly recognizing the systematic record-keeping. "A very profitable business from the looks of these figures." Lucas had moved to examine the distilling equipment along the chamber's wall. "This isn't some farmer's moonshine operation," he called over his shoulder. "This is professional-grade equipment, industrial scale." Jacob nodded, continuing to turn the ledger's pages until he reached entries from 1922, the year the silo had been constructed. The expenditures documented for that period were substantial, with specific notations for surface concealment structure and transport system improvements. The sources of income were coded with locations and initials rather than explicit descriptions. But the amounts spoke for themselves, hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing through this hidden operation. Robert wasn't just participating in bootlegging, Jacob said slowly, the realization crystallizing as he studied the records. He was running a major distribution hub. He set aside the ledger and reached for the stack of letters, most addressed to Robert Harmon, but some being carbon copies of correspondence he had sent. The earliest, dated February 1919, was written on letterhead from Novak Enterprises, Chicago, Illinois, and signed by Frank Novak himself, a name Jacob recognized. From occasional mentions in documentaries about Prohibition-era organized crime. "Mr. Harmon," Jacob read, his voice steady despite the shock of seeing his great-grandfather addressed by a notorious gangster. "Your military record and engineering experience have been brought to my attention by our mutual friend. The business opportunity I proposed during our meeting last month remains open, with the terms as discussed. Initial capital of $50,000 for property acquisition and facility development, with quarterly distributions based on volume. Your location's proximity to the Canadian border and the main eastern transport route makes it ideal for our distribution needs. Security and discretion are, of course, paramount." $50,000 in 1919, Emma whispered. "That would be over $750,000 in today's money," Melissa finished, her expression a mixture of shock and fascination. "As startup capital for a bootlegging operation." The letter continued with specific instructions for establishing banking connections and communication protocols, concluding with a personal note. "Your engineering innovations during the Argonne campaign impressed Colonel Harris significantly. We believe those same skills will prove invaluable to our enterprise. Welcome to the organization." Jacob set the letter aside, his understanding of his family's history undergoing a seismic revision with each document he examined. Robert Harmon hadn't been merely a farmer who had purchased good land after returning from war. He had been recruited by one of Chicago's most powerful criminal organizations to establish a major bootlegging way station, utilizing engineering. Skills he had apparently developed during military service. The photographs proved equally revelatory. Unlike the formal, distant portraits that had been passed down through the family, these showed Robert in unguarded moments, sharing drinks with well-dressed men in Chicago speakeasies, standing proudly beside delivery trucks with hidden compartments, and most surprisingly, demonstrating what appeared to be technical innovations to impressed associates. One photo in particular caught Jacob's attention, Robert standing with Frank Novak himself, both men raising glasses in a toast, with a blueprint visible on the table between them. The casual camaraderie evident in their expressions suggested more than a boss-employee relationship. These men had been partners in a sophisticated criminal enterprise. "Dad, you need to see this," Lucas called from the smaller tunnel he'd discovered earlier. While the others examined the documents, he had continued exploring, his headlamp beam now illuminating another chamber beyond. "It's some kind of vault." Jacob carefully replaced the documents in the metal box and joined his son at the tunnel entrance. The passage beyond was shorter than the first, opening after about 15 feet into a smaller chamber with a distinctive feature. A massive steel door embedded in its far wall, resembling a bank vault, but with an even more elaborate locking mechanism. Unlike the previous doors they'd encountered, this one remained sealed, its complex combination lock apparently designed to withstand serious attempts at unauthorized access. The door's surface bore the now familiar wheat and key symbol, but larger and more ornately rendered, with additional decorative elements suggesting its importance. Whatever was most valuable, they kept it in there, Jacob said, examining the vault door without touching it. The locking mechanism appeared to require both a key and a specific combination sequence, security far beyond what would be necessary for storing ordinary bootlegging profits. They returned to the main chamber, where Melissa had discovered a hidden compartment in the desk's underside containing additional documents, these even more sensitive than those in the metal box. A hand-drawn map showed an elaborate network of distribution points spanning Montana, North Dakota, and Minnesota, with the Harmon farm clearly marked as a major hub connecting Canadian suppliers with Chicago markets. More significantly, she had found what appeared to be Robert's personal journal, its entries providing context for the business records. "Listen to this," she said, carefully turning pages that had remained untouched for decades. April 15th, 1923, completed the final modifications to the hydrologic cooling system today. The increased efficiency should allow us to double production without additional power consumption. Novak has authorized full implementation across the network if the 30-day trial proves successful. My percentage increases by 3 points if adopted, a substantial return on the investment of time and materials. Emma had been examining the distilling equipment with growing appreciation for its design. This wasn't standard technology for the 1920s, she observed. These condensing coils and pressure regulation systems, they're custom-engineered, way ahead of their time. The pieces were coming together, revealing a picture of Robert Harmon vastly different from the stern, straightforward farmer of family law. He had been an innovator, an engineer who had applied his technical genius to bootlegging operations, developing equipment and systems that had apparently revolutionized Novak's illicit liquor business. Jacob found himself mentally recalculating the family's agricultural success through this new lens. The farm's prosperity during economically challenging times, its expansion when neighboring properties struggled, the ready capital for equipment purchases during later generations, all potentially built upon the foundation of bootlegging profits laundered through legitimate agriculture. "There's something else," Melissa said, her finger marking a journal entry from late 1926. "Novak's instructions regarding contingency assets received today. The vault construction is complete, designed to my specifications. Contents to be accessible only to family, with both physical key and combination sequence. Insurance against future uncertainties," he called it, though I suspect he's preparing for eventual war with the East Side operations. "My portion represents fair compensation for 5 years of technical innovation and management." Jacob looked toward the sealed vault with renewed interest. "Contingency assets? You think there's still something valuable in there?" "Only one way to find out," Lucas said, his expression reflecting the same mixture of concern and curiosity they all felt. The implications of discovering significant valuables, particularly if they were the proceeds of Prohibition-era organized crime, raised complex legal and ethical questions. As they contemplated their next steps, Emma's attention was caught by something else, a framed document hanging on the wall near the desk, its glass obscured by decades of dust. Wiping it clean with her sleeve revealed an official-looking certificate bordered with elaborate engraving. "It's a patent," she announced, surprise evident in her voice. "Issued to Robert Harmon in 1925 for improvements in liquid cooling and distillation apparatus. A legitimate patent for technology he developed for illegal bootlegging." This final revelation completed the emerging portrait of Robert Harmon, Not merely a farmer moonlighting in bootlegging, but a technical innovator whose engineering genius had been channeled into illicit enterprise while simultaneously securing legitimate recognition. The contradiction epitomized the complex legacy they were uncovering, where criminal activity had apparently funded what later generations had experienced as honest agricultural prosperity. By mid-afternoon, the Harmon family had established a makeshift research center in the underground chamber. Battery-powered work lights now illuminated the space properly, revealing additional details that had been obscured in the limited beams of their headlamps. A folding table brought from the house held organized stacks of documents, each representing another piece of the puzzle they were assembling about Robert Harmon's secret operation. "We need help," Jacob finally admitted after hours of cataloging their discoveries. These financial records, the engineering documents, the criminal connections, this goes beyond family history. There are potential legal implications we don't understand. Melissa nodded, carefully placing Robert's journal in a protective plastic sleeve she'd retrieved from her teaching supplies. "I have a colleague at the university, Dr. Eleanor Rhodes, in the history department. She specializes in Prohibition-era Montana. If anyone can put this in proper context, it's her." "Can we trust her?" Lucas asked, voicing the concern they'd all been considering. The discovery of a major bootlegging operation, even one nearly a century old, raised questions about potential liability or claims against the property. "Eleanor's discreet," Melissa assured them, "and she has connections at the State Historical Society. If there are legal considerations, she'll know who to consult without broadcasting our situation." Jacob hesitated, then nodded decisively. "Make the call, but let's be selective about what we share initially. I want to understand what we're dealing with before word gets out." While Melissa went to the surface to phone her colleague, Jacob and the children continued their examination of the facility. Emma focused on the engineering aspects, her nascent technical knowledge allowing her to appreciate Robert's innovations. Lucas concentrated on mapping the physical layout of the underground complex, measuring dimensions and documenting structural features. Jacob found himself drawn repeatedly to the sealed vault. The combination lock mechanism appeared operational despite its age, but without the sequence, it remained inaccessible. He studied the journals and correspondence for clues, finding references to contingency security protocols, but no explicit combination. Dr. Eleanor Rhodes arrived 2 hours later, her compact frame belying the energetic enthusiasm she brought to the site. In her 60s, with silver hair cut in a practical bob and sharp eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses, she exuded an aura of academic authority tempered with genuine warmth. "My God," she breathed, taking in the underground chamber with professional appreciation. "This is the most intact Prohibition-era distribution facility I've ever seen. Most were dismantled after repeal or destroyed by rival operations during the period." She moved methodically through the space, her trained historian's eye catching details the family had overlooked. These barrel markings, they're Canadian distillery codes, and these manifest tags indicate transfer points in Minneapolis and Chicago. "Your great-grandfather was operating a major node in the Novak distribution network. You recognize the operation?" Jacob asked, surprised by her immediate grasp of the context. Frank Novak's organization was one of the most sophisticated bootlegging operations in the Midwest, Dr. Rhodes explained, carefully examining the distilling equipment. Most historical accounts suggested his Montana connection was somewhere near Great Falls. Finding it here, intact, is extraordinarily significant. She turned to Jacob, her expression serious. "This isn't just family history, Mr. Harmon. This is a historical treasure trove, a perfectly preserved example of the infrastructure that supported one of America's most notorious black markets." Over the next several hours, Dr. Rhodes provided crucial context for their discoveries. The technical innovations documented in Robert's patents and journals represented significant advances in distillation efficiency, innovations that had later been adopted by legitimate distilleries after Prohibition's repeal. Though the origins had been obscured, the financial records revealed the staggering scale of the operation. At its peak in 1925, the Harmon facility had processed and distributed whiskey valued at over $2 million annually, nearly $30 million in modern currency. Robert's position as regional manager had entitled him to substantial compensation, with monthly payments documented in the ledgers amounting to the equivalent of a successful CEO's salary today. "Your great-grandfather wasn't just a participant," Dr. Rhodes explained, poring over the distribution maps. "He was a key lieutenant in Novak's organization, responsible for the entire northern distribution corridor. His technical innovations apparently gave Novak a significant competitive advantage. Higher quality product, lower production costs, more efficient distribution." By evening, Dr. Rhodes had made several phone calls of her own, consulting discreetly with colleagues. A plan was taking shape for proper documentation of the site, with considerations for both its historical significance and the family's privacy. "I've spoken with Marcus Jenkins at the State Historical Society," she informed them as they gathered around the desk. "He's prepared to send a small team of archaeological specialists to document the site properly. They can be here tomorrow." "Morning. And the legal implications?" Jacob asked, the practical question foremost in his mind. "Fascinating question," Dr. Rhodes replied, her academic interest evident. "The statute of limitations on prohibition violations expired decades ago. The property and contents clearly belong to the Harmon family as legal heirs. The historical significance, however, likely qualifies the site for potential designation as a historical landmark, which could have tax implications, mostly positive ones, actually." A new voice joined the conversation from the tunnel entrance. The historical designation could also protect the property from corporate acquisition under the state agricultural heritage statutes. They turned to see a tall, distinguished man in his 50s entering the chamber, accompanied by a younger woman carrying professional camera equipment. "Marcus Jenkins," the man introduced himself, extending his hand to Jacob. "State Historical Society." Dr. Rhodes's description was compelling enough that I decided to make the drive immediately rather than waiting until morning. "This is Kate Simmons, our documentation specialist." Jenkins surveyed the chamber with undisguised excitement. "In 30 years of historical preservation work, I've never seen anything like this. A completely intact Prohibition-era distribution facility with documentation and artifacts in situ." Kate had already begun photographing the space, her professional camera capturing high-resolution images of the equipment, documents, and structural features. "The preservation quality is remarkable," she commented. "The stable temperature and humidity down here, combined with the sealed environment, created nearly perfect archival conditions." Jenkins turned back to Jacob, his expression serious. "Dr. Rhodes mentioned your concerns about Sentinel Agribusiness's acquisition efforts. I believe this discovery fundamentally changes your situation." He produced a tablet from his briefcase, pulling up relevant regulations. "Under Montana Code 23,127, properties with demonstrated historical significance related to the state's economic development may qualify for heritage protection status. This prevents forced sale or eminent domain claims by corporate entities." "The bootlegging operation qualifies as economic development?" Lucas asked skeptically. Jenkins nodded. "Absolutely. Prohibition-era enterprises represented a significant economic force in Montana's development. While illegal at the time, their historical importance is recognized under current preservation statutes." He gestured toward the distilling equipment. "Beyond that, Your great-grandfather's technical innovations, documented in these patents and journals, represent legitimate contributions to industrial processes. The fact that they were developed in service of bootlegging doesn't diminish their historical and technical significance. Dr. Rhodes had moved to examine the sealed vault door. "This is particularly intriguing," she said. "Based on Robert's journal entries, this appears to be what Novak called a contingency vault, a secure storage facility for assets that might need to survive a federal raid or gang warfare." "Any idea what's inside?" Jenkins asked, joining her. "The journals reference private reserves and security holdings," Melissa explained, "but no specific inventory." Kate had finished her preliminary photography and was setting up specialized equipment for detailed documentation. The Historical Society would typically use ground-penetrating radar to examine sealed spaces without compromising them, she explained. But given the family's ownership rights, the decision to open the vault would be entirely yours, Mr. Harmon. Jacob considered this carefully. The day's revelations had transformed his understanding of his family's legacy. The farm that had represented 4 generations of honest agricultural work now appeared to have been built on a foundation of bootlegging profits and criminal connections. Yet there was also pride in discovering Robert's technical brilliance, his entrepreneurial success, and his apparent transition to legitimate business after Prohibition's end. The complex moral calculus of judging a great-grandfather's choices made during a different era was not something Jacob had prepared for. "Before we make any decisions about the vault," he said finally, "I want to understand the full historical context. What happened to Novak's organization after Prohibition? How did our family transition to legitimate farming? And most importantly, are there potential claimants to whatever might be in that vault?" Jenkins nodded approvingly. "Prudent questions. The Historical Society can help with research into Novak's later operations and potential succession claims, though most criminal organizations of that era had no legal standing for asset recovery. There's something else to consider," Dr. Rhodes added. "The historical value of an intact, unopened Prohibition-era vault is considerable. If you decide to preserve it as is, the academic community would certainly find ways to support that choice." As nightfall approached, temporary lighting was established throughout the underground facility. Jenkins had called in additional experts who would arrive the following day, specialists in historical preservation, archaeological documentation, and Prohibition-era artifacts. The Harmon farm, which just 24 hours earlier had faced potential for closure and corporate acquisition, had suddenly become the center of intense historical interest. The collapse of a century-old silo had revealed not just a secret bootlegging operation, but potentially a pathway to preserving the family's agricultural legacy, albeit in a form Jacob could never have imagined. Morning brought a flurry of activity. To the Harmon farm, Historical Society staff arrived in a procession of vehicles, bringing specialized equipment and expertise. The team quickly established protocols for documenting every aspect of the underground facility while preserving its integrity. Jacob watched this transformation with mixed emotions. The immediate threat of foreclosure seemed temporarily abated as Jenkins had initiated paperwork for historical designation, but the family's privacy had evaporated overnight. Their farm, their history, was suddenly a matter of public interest and academic study. "Mr. Harmon," a voice interrupted his thoughts. A middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair approached, carrying an archival storage box. "I'm Dr. Veronica Paulson, Prohibition-era document specialist. We've been analyzing the correspondence between your great-grandfather and Frank Novak." She carefully opened the box to reveal letters organized in acid-free sleeves. "There's a pattern here suggesting your great-grandfather wasn't just an employee. He was specifically selected for this operation." Novak mentions family aptitude repeatedly. Family aptitude? Jacob echoed. Yes. Apparently, Robert's father, your great-great-grandfather, had connections to whiskey production in Kentucky before moving west. There are references to inherited knowledge and generational skill. This revelation struck Jacob profoundly. The bootlegging operation hadn't been a random criminal opportunity. It represented a continuation of family expertise redirected during Prohibition. Robert hadn't betrayed the family's agricultural legacy. He had extended a different family tradition. Inside the main chamber, Emma had been working with Dr. Rhodes to catalogue Robert's technical innovations. As Jacob joined them, he noticed his daughter handling the century-old equipment with surprising familiarity. She has an intuitive understanding of the hydraulic systems, Dr. Rhodes remarked. I've been studying Prohibition-era distillation for 20 years, but your daughter immediately grasped how Robert's pressure regulation innovations functioned. Emma looked up, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and pride. It just makes sense to me, like I've seen it before. Dr. Paulson overheard this exchange and approached with another document. This might explain that, she said, presenting a family tree Robert had maintained with peculiar notations beside certain names. He was tracking technical aptitude through the family line, engineering ability, spatial reasoning, mechanical innovation. He noted similar patterns emerging in specific generations. Jacob studied the document, finding his father's name with an annotation, shows technical inheritance, should be encouraged toward engineering. The same notation appeared beside Jacob's own name, added in his father's handwriting rather than Robert's. This extends beyond Robert, Dr. Paulson explained. There are references to a family tradition of master distillers dating back to Scotland in the 1700s. When American Prohibition made that skill illegal, Robert repurposed it for bootlegging while simultaneously developing legitimate patents to preserve the family's technical innovations for the future. Lucas joined them, bringing another journal he'd discovered behind the filing cabinet. Dad, look at this. Great-grandpa Robert kept detailed records of every Harmon child's natural abilities. He has whole sections about identifying and nurturing specific talents. The journal contained meticulous observations about mechanical aptitude, problem-solving, approaches, and structural visualization skills, traits Robert had apparently valued and tracked through generations. Jacob recognized descriptions of his own childhood tinkering, details he'd never shared, but his father had evidently reported to his grandfather. He was preserving more than whiskey, Dr. Rhodes observed. He was documenting and nurturing a family tradition of innovation spanning generations. A commotion near the sealed vault interrupted their conversation. Jenkins approached with an elderly man whose movements remained spry despite his advanced age. "This is Howard Phillips," Jenkins introduced him. "He saw our vehicles and came over. Says he has information about the vault." Howard nodded to Jacob. "Told you that Silo held secrets," he said with a slight smile. "My father worked for your great-grandfather, not just on the silo construction, but as his assistant for years afterward." "Your father knew about the bootlegging?" Jacob asked. "Knew about it?" "He helped manage it after Robert started focusing on his technical innovations. Dad was one of the few locals Robert trusted completely." Howard produced an old envelope from his jacket pocket. "He left me this. Said to give it to a Harmon if the underground facility ever came to light." Inside the envelope was a single page containing a sequence of numbers and a brief note. "Combination to Robert's vault. Family property, rightfully theirs. Walter Phillips, 1968. Howard looked directly at Jacob. "Dad said Robert converted everything to legitimate assets before he died, said he was determined that his grandchildren and great-grandchildren would inherit clean prosperity. Whatever's in that vault, he meant it for your family, Jacob studied the numerical sequence, recognizing a pattern that corresponded to significant dates in Harmon family history. The vault combination, Jacob said quietly, feeling the weight of generations converging in this moment. Your father kept this secret for over 50 years. Howard nodded. Dad said Robert built this place to secure the family's future. Said the Harmons had a gift that shouldn't be wasted on just farming. Though he meant no offense by that. Jacob looked around at the assembled experts, his family, and the remarkable technological achievements of a great-grandfather he was only now beginning to understand. I think, he said, turning toward the vault, it's time to complete the discovery. The vault door stood before them, its elaborate locking mechanism gleaming under the work lights. Though nearly a century old, the precision engineering was evident in every detail, another testament to Robert Harmon's technical abilities. The entire documentation team had gathered to witness this moment, cameras ready to capture the opening of a time capsule sealed since the Prohibition era. Jacob carefully entered the combination from Howard Phillips' note, each number aligning with significant Harmon family dates, Robert's birth year, the farm's purchase date, and what Jacob recognized as his grandfather William's birth date. The mechanism responded with satisfying clicks, but remained sealed until he inserted the ornate key from the metal box, turning it with deliberate precision. A series of heavy thuds emanated from within the door as locking bolts retracted. Then, with a soft hiss suggesting an airtight seal being broken, the massive steel portal swung open on remarkably well-maintained hinges. The assembled group collectively held their breath as the vault's interior came into view. Unlike the workshop and distribution facility outside, this space had been designed purely for secure storage. Metal shelving lined 3 walls, while a large safe occupied the center of the small room. But it was the contents of those shelves that drew gasps from the historical experts. "My God," Dr. Rhodes whispered, her professional composure momentarily abandoned. "That's pre-Prohibition whiskey. Priceless." Dozens of wooden cases contained bottles with manufacturing dates ranging from 1905 to 1918. The years before Prohibition had rendered such products contraband. Each bore manufacturing stamps and tax seals indicating legal production, with documented provenance cards attached. "Your great-grandfather wasn't just a bootlegger," Jenkins said, carefully examining one bottle without touching it. "He was a collector preserving legitimate whiskey before it disappeared during Prohibition." Beyond the whiskey collection, other shelves held folders of documents, each labeled methodically with dates and subject indicators. Dr. Paulson approached these with reverent care, donning archival gloves before examining the contents. "These are technical drawings," she announced, surprise evident in her voice. "Dozens of innovations that were never patented. Distillation methods, cooling systems, pressure regulation designs. Some of these predate Robert's work by decades. Family traditions," Jacob murmured, connecting this find to the earlier revelations about inherited knowledge. The technical expertise passed down through generations. Emma had moved to examine another section of documents, these organized by year rather than subject. "These are financial records," she reported, "but not bootlegging money. Legitimate. Investments dating from 1927 forward. Stock certificates, property deeds, bank records." The central safe remained unopened, its combination unknown, but the vault's other contents were already revealing Robert's careful planning for his family's future. As Prohibition's end approached, he had systematically converted illegal profits into legitimate holdings, creating a financial foundation that would support generations of Harmons without carrying the taint of criminal enterprise. Dr. Rhodes carefully examined what appeared to be Robert's transition plan, a detailed strategy for converting the bootlegging operation into legitimate agricultural business as repeal loomed. He wasn't just hiding from the law, she explained. He was preparing for the end of Prohibition, positioning the family for legitimate success afterward. Jenkins had been consulting with colleagues via phone, his excitement growing with each conversation. The historical significance extends far beyond Montana, he informed Jacob. What we're seeing here is evidence of how Prohibition-era wealth was laundered into legitimate enterprises that shaped regional development throughout the mid-20th century. This is a missing piece in American economic history. As documentation continued, Howard Phillips shared additional context gleaned from his father's recollections. Dad said Robert was obsessed with creating a clean legacy for his descendants. Once Prohibition ended, he seemingly became the straight-arrow farmer everyone remembers, but he never stopped inventing. He just applied his innovations to agricultural equipment instead of distilling. This explained the technical patents Jacob remembered seeing on the farmhouse walls during his childhood, innovations in irrigation systems and harvesting equipment that had generated modest royalties for decades. Those hadn't been Robert's first inventions, but rather the public face of a technical brilliance that had earlier been applied to illicit enterprises. The implications extended beyond the Harmon family. Dr. Rhodes identified connections between Robert's operation and the development of regional infrastructure. Roads improved to facilitate bootlegging that later supported agricultural shipping. Electrical systems extended to rural areas to power secret operations that subsequently benefited legitimate farms. Prohibition didn't just create criminal enterprises, she explained to the fascinated Harmons. It inadvertently funded rural development that legitimate businesses and government wouldn't invest in at the time. When Prohibition ended, that infrastructure remained, becoming the foundation for legitimate economic growth. Jenkins had stepped away for another call, returning with news that transformed the discovery's significance yet again. I've consulted with the National Historical Registry. This site qualifies for emergency preservation status based on its unique intact condition and comprehensive documentation. That designation would include not just the underground facility, but the surrounding farmland as part of the historical landscape. He turned to Jacob, his expression serious. Mr. Harmon, that status would legally protect your entire property from corporate acquisition attempts. Sentinel Agribusiness cannot force purchase of historically protected land, nor can they operate adjacent properties in ways that might damage the historical site. The expanded significance of their discovery was becoming clear. What had begun as a shocking revelation about a family's secret past had evolved into a resource with national historical importance, one that could potentially preserve not just the Harmon farm, but their entire way of life. There's more, Jenkins continued. The whiskey collection alone represents a museum-quality assemblage of pre-Prohibition spirits. While it belongs to your family, its historical value would qualify for significant tax benefits if partially donated to educational institutions. As the experts continued their assessment, Jacob gathered his family in a quiet corner of the main chamber. This changes everything, he said simply, not just our understanding of Robert, but the farm's future. Over the following week, the underground facility beneath the collapsed silo transformed from shocking discovery to methodically documented historical site. Experts from various fields had established a careful preservation protocol, ensuring that every artifact was properly recorded while respecting the Harmon family's ownership rights. The central safe in the vault had finally yielded its secrets after a specialist from the Historical Society managed to open it without damage. Inside lay the culmination of Robert Harmon's foresight, legal documents establishing a family trust funded by his legitimate investments following Prohibition, with specific instructions for supporting future generations of Harmons who wished to continue working the land. Most significantly, the trust contained stock certificates for companies that had emerged from Prohibition-era enterprises, regional transportation firms, distribution networks, and manufacturing concerns that had originally been established to support bootlegging, but had successfully transitioned to legitimate business. These investments, untouched for nearly a century, had appreciated to a value that left the entire family speechless. Approximately $8 million, the financial analyst Jenkins had brought in reported matter-of-factly, all in legitimate holdings, properly documented with taxes paid throughout. The trust is structured to support the farm's operations in perpetuity while providing educational funds for Harmon descendants. Jacob sat at his kitchen table, the modern financial documents spread before him, creating a stark contrast to the century-old ledgers still being catalogued below ground. The immediate threat of foreclosure had vanished, replaced by security his family hadn't known for generations. Emma's college education was now fully funded, as was Lucas's whenever he chose to pursue it. But the culmination of their discovery extended beyond financial salvation. The historical designation had been expedited due to the site's exceptional condition and significance, creating a protective boundary around the entire Harmon property that effectively blocked Sentinel Agribusiness's expansion plans. "Your great-grandfather's foresight was remarkable," Dr. Rhodes commented as they reviewed Robert's personal journals from the later Prohibition years. He anticipated both the end of Prohibition and the eventual consolidation of agricultural land. His trust specifies that the farm must remain operational and family-owned to access the financial resources. The underground facility itself presented both opportunity and responsibility. As a unique historical site, it could be developed for limited educational tours that would provide additional income while preserving its integrity. The Historical Society had proposed a partnership that would maintain the Harmon's ownership while providing resources for proper preservation. Beyond the financial and historical implications, the discovery had transformed the family's understanding of their heritage. Rather than simply inheriting a struggling farm with a proud agricultural tradition, they had discovered a legacy of innovation, adaptation, and technical brilliance that spanned generations. Emma had found her own connection to this legacy. Her natural aptitude for engineering suddenly contextualized by the documentation of similar skills through the family line. Lucas, whose mechanical abilities had previously been directed solely toward farm equipment maintenance, now recognized these talents as part of a longer tradition of technical innovation. As sunset painted the farm in golden light, Jacob stood where the old silo had once towered, looking out over fields that would remain in Harmon hands for at least another generation. The secret chamber beneath his feet had not only preserved bootlegging history and family wealth, it had revealed a more complex and remarkable family story than he had ever imagined. "Robert didn't just build a hiding place," he said to Melissa, as she joined him. "He built a future." 3 months after the storm that had revealed generations of secrets, the Harmon farm bore little resemblance to the struggling operation that had faced imminent foreclosure. The collapsed silo had been partially reconstructed, not as a functional grain storage facility, but as a historical monument marking the entrance to what was now officially designated as the Harmon Prohibition Heritage Site, a discreet visitor center designed to blend harmoniously with the agricultural landscape, provided context for the limited tours now permitted into the underground facility. The Historical Society had partnered with the Harmon family to create an educational experience that balanced historical significance with the privacy of a working family farm. More importantly, the remaining agricultural operation had been revitalized. The trust funds established by Robert had enabled Jacob to invest in sustainable farming technologies that honored both the land's natural ecology and the family's innovative tradition. New irrigation systems, designed with Emma's input during her college breaks, utilized principles that echoed Robert's efficiency innovations while serving modern sustainable agriculture. "It's strange," Jacob remarked to Howard Phillips as they watched a group of university students departing after a scheduled tour. "For generations, we thought we were just farmers fighting against the odds. Turns out we were inheritors of something much more complex." Howard nodded, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "My father always said there was more to Robert Harmon than met the eye. Said he was a man who planted seeds meant to sprout long after he was gone." The metaphor was particularly apt. Beyond the financial security the discovery had provided, the most profound impact had been on the family's understanding of itself. Emma had changed her college focus to agricultural engineering, inspired by the technical drawings found in the vault. Lucas had discovered an aptitude for historical preservation, working alongside the experts to document and maintain the underground facility's unique features. Melissa had found her own connection to the legacy, compiling an oral history project that collected memories from elderly county residents about Prohibition-era Montana, stories that had nearly vanished as generations passed. The resulting archive had become a valuable resource for researchers nationwide, positioning the farm as a center for historical understanding beyond its physical artifacts. The broader community had also been transformed, as Sentinel Agribusiness's expansion plans were thwarted by the historical designation. Other struggling family farms in the region had found breathing room to explore alternative approaches. The Harmons had used a portion of the trust to establish a cooperative equipment sharing program, allowing smaller operations to access technology they couldn't individually afford. Perhaps most significantly, the discovery had changed how the Harmons viewed their relationship to their land and history. What had once seemed a burden of obligation, maintaining the family farm despite mounting obstacles, had been revealed as a deliberately crafted gift from a visionary ancestor who had transformed an illegal enterprise into a foundation for generations of legitimate prosperity. As twilight settled over the revitalized property, Jacob stood in the underground chamber that had changed everything, now carefully preserved and subtly illuminated to protect its historical integrity. The distilling equipment gleamed under conservation lighting, the technical innovations of his great-grandfather, now recognized as significant contributions to industrial design rather than merely tools of bootlegging. He wasn't just hiding wealth, Jacob said to his assembled family as they prepared for a private commemoration marking the storm's 3-month anniversary. He was hiding hope, preserving opportunity for people he would never meet. Emma nodded thoughtfully. And preserving knowledge, technical skills and innovations that might have been lost. He transformed something illegal into something lasting, Lucas added. Found a way to make something good grow from complicated beginnings. Melissa reached for Jacob's hand, like good farmers always do, taking whatever circumstances provide and cultivating something better for the next season. As they raised glasses in a toast to Robert's memory, containing water rather than whiskey, a gentle family joke, Jacob recognized that the true fortune discovered beneath the old silo hadn't been the financial windfall, valuable as it was. The real treasure had been the revelation of purpose and continuity, the understanding that their seemingly ordinary family farm represented one link in a chain of innovation, adaptation, and foresight, stretching back generations and now extending forward into a future Robert Harmon had carefully planned for, but would never see. The collapsed silo had revealed not just a hidden tunnel to material wealth, but a passage connecting past to future, a legacy transcending both the legitimate and illegitimate means of its creation to become something more enduring, a story of human ingenuity, preservation, and hope passed from one generation to the next. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.